As always, get a hold of me right there, Marcelo at headlesscreator.com. Today's conversation is very, very cool, very near and dear to my heart. It's all about structured content and knowledge graphs for the enterprise. With my guest, I've been trying to get here for a long time. Finally, he's here. Aaron Bradley. He's Senior Structured Content Architect at TELUS. But before we get started, you know how this works. You need to go get your free account at headlesscreator.com. You'll have access to this interview later on demand. You also have access to the entire Discover Headless Tech course, which is not just interviews, but also a bunch of tutorials that you can get right there. So make sure you go get that, and then you'll have access to a bunch of stuff. The Content Modeling Weekly, the Discover Headless Tech course, Weekly Tips, Composable Commerce. This is a brand new course, which we promised we were going to launch, and we launched it. We've got tips there and many more coming. A bunch of Headless CMS courses, bootcamp courses. We're going to have another Weekly Tips coming out soon, so stay tuned for that. All right, with that said, I'm going to go ahead and remove that. For those of you watching live, if you have any questions for Aaron, please put them in the chat because I will ask Aaron. With that, Aaron, welcome.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. Thank you for having me. Pleasure.
Glad to have you here. Finally got you. It's been a while. Been trying to get you, and you're a busy guy. And you recently switched, right? Companies,
job.
Job, which we're going to be talking about in just a second. But before we get started, tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. My careers, plural, all are nicely segmented into 10-year, decade-long stints. So starting out as a technical services librarian for the Canadian Forces Command and Staff College in Toronto.
Oh, wow.
Where I cataloged books about World War II. And from there, at the end of that stint, I created the college's first website, or first publicly facing website. So spent the next 10 years as a website designer, which kind of gave me a lot of insight into building for the World Wide Web. And I'm old, so this was way back in the day.
And you're old.
You're not old. 1994 was, I believe, when I started that website, and I was still doing, Unix grep commands in order to look at access log statistics. So very much.
So you're probably using Gopher or something like that, right?
Yeah, actually, that's an interesting, and I'm sure many people are going, "What, Gopher?"
See, I'm as old as you. That's why I know all this stuff.
For those not familiar, Gopher was an early protocol for the web, or
the precursor.
Internet, sort of like the World Wide Web. And my boss and I had an early conversation about whether we should have a Gopher site or a website, and we made the right choice there.
You chose well, yes.
So then working as a web designer, which was fine. I am, however, a little colorblind, which didn't do much for my design career. And I knew that I was a decent, but was never going to be a great web designer. So I made a conscious choice in the early 2000s to pivot to web marketing, specifically to search engine optimization, where I spent another decade in the trenches working on all aspects of organic SEO. I never did paid search marketing. That was never much of a bean counter, which is how I relegated the role unfairly of paid search, but had a lot of interest in organic search, and really enjoyed the community and the group of people that were invested in that. And it was through my work in SEO that I first became acquainted with what was at that time called the semantic web, what we might more generally refer to as the world of linked data, or as we'll be talking about shortly, knowledge graphs, and specifically became from 2011 on invested in schema.org, the effort by Yahoo and Google and Bing, and then later Yandex, to create a common set of schemas for use in the World Wide Web and other search engines. And that's become widely successful since then. But that brought me a lot into the world of structured data and linked data and knowledge graphs. And from there, I moved on to electronic arts, where I began in continuing my search work, but then began working increasingly in that linked data world and ended up with them working on a content graph, a content knowledge graph, which was very exciting. And then just very recently, just mid-July, moved on from electronic arts to work for TELUS, especially your American viewers may not, or British viewers may not be aware of it, but it's a large telecommunications concern in Canada, like Verizon, AT&T, one of those big shops. I don't have too much to say about my experience there yet. I'm excited to be there and working then full-time as a structured content or a structured content architect. And both, I guess, and for Headless Creator fans, the crossover there specifically is that both of these shops incorporate Contentful. So I've moved from one partial Contentful environment to another Contentful environment. So very much continuing to be immersed in the world of content models and structured content.
And we're going to be talking about the structure content architect role, because I believe that's an important one. That was my previous role where I worked before Uniform at Service Titan.
I will be hitting you up for tips, Marcel.
What's that?
I will be hitting you up for tips.
Oh, no. You definitely, you're the guy that creates all this stuff. So no, definitely you know a lot there. But you mentioned schema.org. So is that what Google is using to define all of their structure, or do they have their own? And what's your take on that?
Sure. Yes and yes, or partially and yes. So schema.org is used by publishers to indicate on their web properties, and it is primarily web, although other internet resources are kind of implicated by that. And I'll just say now, because it can become confusing, and for those of us in the structured content world, where of course one of the benefits of structured content, or potential benefits, is create once and publish everywhere for different endpoints. When we say the web, it doesn't necessarily mean websites. It can just mean the internet, where you have content that's provided to different endpoints, and this includes Google and Bing and the other search engines now. It's not just what they collect off the World Wide Web in terms of websites, but also ingestion of feeds and other direct data that feed into not their search index of websites, but their knowledge graph, which we're going to be talking about. So schema.org represents a way for anybody that has a website to play in, or to be part of the search engines, including Google, but also Bing and Yahoo and the index, their knowledge graphs, because it allows publishers to declare information about the content they're providing that is not just what that content is, but what it's about, the entities that are present there. So if I wrote an article about Headless Creator, it wouldn't just be an article, the thing itself, but I could say this is about the organization Headless Creator, and then I would say Headless Creator is run by Marcelo, and that you live in such and such a place. All these structured data facts that then feed into those search engines knowledge graphs. But that is, and you asked about Google's knowledge graph. So that's kind of the public input into their knowledge graph. It's an input, but they have a massive knowledge base of facts that is the bulk of their knowledge graph, which is drawn, as we'll talk about, I'm sure shortly, a variety of sources, most notably, but by no means exclusively, Wikipedia.
Well, and an example also could be like if you have recipes, you need to define that it's a recipe, and then you search that on Google for recipes, let's say, and you will see recipes on top, specific recipes, right? That's pulling all from that schema.org, right? Because you've defined it.
Yeah, that is a great example where it's not, let's say prior to 2010, there's a little bit of an exaggeration, because for those that are familiar, prior to schema.org, there were some other structured content data schemes, most notably microformats, which had a recipe format, and now schema.org recipe. But rather than just a blob, right, on a post on a site, it says, no, this is actually a recipe. It has these specific ingredients. It has this preparation time. It has these methods. It's about this type of cuisine. And so obviously, it's not difficult to see how a data consumer like a search engine can then use that information to provide very specific information to users that they're searching for. So when you or I type something like recipe with chicken and tomato, that's not, Google is not then restricted to looking for those keywords in a bunch of content. It can say, oh, okay, in my recipe database in the knowledge graph, right? What recipes do I have that have ingredients chicken and ingredient tomato? And exactly. A much better search result than that string blob.
Well, the possibilities are then you can do some integration with other systems and say, buy these ingredients, right? Because the ingredients, that this is an ingredient and not just a word in a page.
Correct. And you can even, go further in terms of the world of structured data, and it may not actually be usable by the search engine at this point, but with the other systems to say, chicken is, and you can actually say chicken has this ID, right? Which is some Wikidata or Wikipedia URI. And then a system can then go and look up other things about chicken. It's a data journey that you can start to connect things. And as we talk about knowledge graph, you'll see that is far and above the tie that binds, is that knowledge graphs are all about connecting different types of facts,
relationships,
knowledge in a sensible fashion.
Yeah, totally. All right, let's take a step back, because I jumped the gun. We went straight into the hardest part, but let's take a step back so we can all be on the same page here. And let's start by defining content. And how is that different from a spreadsheet full of data?
Sure. You didn't plan this, I know, Marcelo, but I couldn't have asked for a better question, because I spent literally the last 2 years thinking about this almost every day.
Well, I'm glad I waited a while to get you on the podcast, because now you have an answer.
I do, and I'll give you the pointer too, because there's now an article that discusses this definition in great length that, as I said, took me 2 years to come up with. And I'll just say that, and then we'll talk about it, which is that content is data materialized as information for human consumption.
Okay.
So the building block of all content is data, but just data is not content, because it's not comprehensible by a human, and it's not provided to them in a form that they can discover. And I'll say, for anyone that's interested in the backstory, as it were, to what we're discussing, you can look up my post called, strangely, What is Content, on my site, The Graph Lounge.
And we'll link it on the show notes.
That's great.
But give us an example of data, and then give us an example of data that is consumptible by a user, and now it's content.
Sure. Well, I'll use one that I've used in that post, which is a table of weather information, right? And most data traditionally is stored in terms of relational databases. So spreadsheets, very familiar in this regard, where you have a bunch of rows and you have a bunch of columns, and you have things like temp and location, and then you have in those cells things like 33. But we live in Canada here, it's Celsius, so
right.
I'm thinking contemporarily, and geocode. So there's data about a forecast, right, that exists in a spreadsheet. But unless I know all of the keys in terms of the key value pairs there, unless I know what each of those columns actually mean and what each of those values actually mean, I may or may not be able to figure out what that forecast is. But when I run that through a rendering system that provides things like where it says temp, I'm going to then display in such a fashion something that is very obviously the temperature, right, 33. Then that becomes content because it's provided to me, a human, in a form that I can understand. Whereas before it was just data locked in a table. And even if that data was highly described, that is to say, I can make sense of this, it's still not content because it's still locked in a table, right? Content has to be materialized. And the reason I've spent so much time thinking about this and coming up with this definition, and basically pretty pleased with myself for what I arrived at, is that I searched around, and that most of the definitions of content were all of the definitions of content, some of them, you know, pretty good, but they were still squishy, right? That I wanted something that I could use as an Occam's razor of, is this content or is this not? And it didn't satisfy this. And that definition does. And the reason that that's important and exciting to me in a bizarre way is that it helps formulate questions about what you need for content, right? So it sees content as possibility, as an experience, right? Because it's something that's materialized. Content is often thought of as artifacts, right? And it puts the emphasis not on the artifact itself, what the thing that the viewer or listener experiences, and puts the emphasis on its production, right? What does it take to get, you know, all the bits and pieces that are need to come together to have the Headless Creator podcast, right? Because it doesn't exist as content until somebody watches it like us. And the other thing that I'll kind of stress in terms of any definition of contemporary content and the enterprise is that it's dynamic and potential, right? That in a world of personalization and recommendation and modular, as we'll be discussing, modular and structured content, there's not so much something I provide to everyone as a spectrum of content that I produce for individuals based on what I know about them, or what my marketing goals are, or what I think they're interested in, right? So when you think of content as some little discrete artifact, it tends to flatten the view of that. But content, again, is in the modern enterprise, or should be, dynamic, right? And that's what differentiates it too from data. Is you have a bunch of raw data which can suit anyone, but through the application of whatever sort of filtering and machine learning and data science that you want, you say, I'm going to take this same bucket of data and provide it as different types of content for different people.
So that means, to me, it sounds like it's heavily tied to a presentation layer. So in other words, it's data until it's presented and consumed, right? So, correct. Which means that schema.org really is more like data.
Correct.
And the page where it resides and it's presented to the end user, that's your content. So it almost sounds like data and content have to work together anyway.
They do.
For things to be functional.
Yeah, and as I said, the building, in my definition, in any case,
right.
Data is the building block of all content, right? What is content made of? It's made of data, but it's not just data, it's data provided, and this is like critically important, this word, in a context that users
right.
understand. And you can actually have that same data, you know, kind of what people would think of as core content, provided in a different context, and it changes what that means. You can provide exactly the same thing to two different people, but in two different contexts, and it changes the meaning of that data. So, you know, in that materialization of data, context becomes critical and changes the meaning.
Right, definitely. Cool. And when I say presentation layer, I don't mean visual only. It could be anything, right?
For sure.
An IoT device that's voice driven is a presentation layer.
Yeah, and that's you know, to the point of the definition about that materialization, right? It has to
Exactly.
be manifested in some way that I, as a human, can ingest it, and that's a great point. That we think, you know, we tend to think visually, and we tend to think of websites. So, and the likes of you and I speak quite a lot about the presentation layer, but it's really a materialization layer.
Exactly.
Because
I love that. Yeah.
yeah. Certainly something, you know, where you can have, and here's an example, you can have an article, right, which one may think of as a web artifact, or maybe something that goes into an app, but of course that can also be read aloud on a